So, socialism is one form of these new competing forces or ideologies. Scientific socialism, as conceived by Marx, or Marxism, is a radical version of this, and it's going to have a large impact. On the other side of the coin, there's a emerging form of new styles of nationalism. Nationalism can play a role in both the left and the right in politics of the 20th century. Let me first talk about what nationalism is or how it has changed. In the early 19th century, this idea is who the nation is, who makes up this idea of the nation. In early 19th century was or were the elites of this society, the aristocracy, the nobles. These were the people who made up the nation. So if you talk to a Polish member of the aristocracy in 1800 and you asked him, who is the nation? He would say this gentry elite, this aristocracy group. He would not discuss the people. The idea that there are Poles, or that there's this large group of this territorial unit known as Poland full of Poles who make up the nation would be unheard of. It's not a conception they have in 1800. That's all going to change in the 19th century, where people are going to start saying, what does it mean to be Polish? And then there's going to be these, generally from the aristocracy, are going to set the guidelines for who's in and who's out. And depending where you were, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, it could be a linguistic issue, it could be a cultural issue, it could be a language issue, various different ideas. To add fuel to this fire of nationalism, which has a tendency to not only choose who's in and who's out, but to exclude people as well, and this is where it creates rising tension throughout Europe, is the idea of race. Race is an idea that emerges in the late 19th century, that there are different races of people with different characteristics. And with the ideas of Darwinism, which said there was a survival of the fittest and a competition within species and such, this idea is applied to society. And an idea emerges known as social Darwinism, which promotes race theory. And what I mean by this is that, and depending on who's doing the definition, they look at the human population and say that there are, for example, white people, there are black people, there are, in the 19th century, sometimes color designations. There are brown people, there are yellow people, so that's one kind of definition. And then they give characteristics to what each of these people are. But it goes into further when it mixes with nationalism. That suddenly there's not just white people, but there are Polish people, there are Jewish people, there are Russian people, there are French people. And somehow, biologically, these people somehow have different characteristics now that people wanted to point to and study and such. And when we look to the ideology of Hitler and Nazism, he takes this idea of social Darwinism and applies it to Germany. He's going to say the German race is a superior race and has these characteristics, and these other races are lesser races, and etc. We look back on this today and say this is something we want to reject. And but at the time period, it was not. Hitler's theory was very much accepted in many circles. The idea that there are different races, and this somehow is connected with nationalism, really became widely accepted throughout Europe at the time period. Also, the idea of eugenics, where we try to breed better human beings, also was widely accepted in the 1920s and 1930s. And everyone has a different version of this during this time period. But it wasn't seen as something that was outside of the norm in scientific discussions at the time period. Today, genetics rejects the idea of race completely, but yet we still talk about it in this term this term often. And you think about in the language, when, for example, when we say in terms of non-discriminatory language, we say we won't want to discriminate against race, gender, sex, or blah, 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 and you have a whole list. The fact that we still use this term race, and that there's different races of people, harkens back to this time period, that somehow biologically I'm different if I am a Hungarian, or I'm biologically different if I am a Scot or an Englishman, that somehow I have certain characteristics and traits. And what happens is people will say, this is the traits of these people, and then and in some ways celebrate these particular characteristics, whatever they say they were. The Germans, for example, under Hitler, are going to talk about organization and cleanliness, and these are things that they are going to deem as being inherently German or whatever. So this idea of race combined with nationalism becomes this deadly mix that is going to be applied to Europe later on with Hitler. But it's a dangerous idea that still remains today in many ways. People will say blacks are this way, or Asians are blah 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 blah, and or you might say to yourself, well, I do this because I'm Italian, or I like to talk with my hands because I'm Italian, or the Hungarians might say, well, we have this this sad temperament as Hungarians, and blah blah blah, as if this is a biological characteristic. Like I said, today genetics completely rejects this. Many people are getting a genetic spectrum test done to see where their various background traces in terms of territories or migrations on the planet, and people are very surprised. I remember reading about this one woman who had who considered herself an Hispanic, Mexican Hispanic, and she found that she had migration of certain patterns in her genetics from northeastern Europe, what we consider Poland today. She had characteristics of Central Africa. She had some characteristics of certain groups in Siberia. And these were just, and the way genetics looks at this today is that there were certain genetic tendencies from areas that were isolated oftentimes. That's why, for example, certain groups today might be more prone to certain diseases like Tay-Sachs disease or something like this. But regardless, when this combines with politics, it becomes very dangerous, right? When you're ranking individuals and ranking groups within your country borders based on superiority, it becomes an excuse to exclude people again. And Hitler is going to take particular target against Slavic speakers to the east. And he's going to consider the Slavs very dangerous, and of course he's going to take particular action against Jews. But it's also going to be, he's going to practice eugenic theory, where he's going to kill Germans who are what we consider today special needs for mental conditions. He's going to sterilize women, German women. There will be projects to try and create what he would consider a master race. And I said this theory of eugenics, where you try to breed people, was very well accepted in the first half of the 20th century. How does this come about into politics? Well, we now are going to push this into a national agenda, and I'll talk about that in the next section.